Feel the weight of your own hands for a moment, the quiet strength in your fingers, the pulse that never stops arranging the hours of your life. You've carried more than people know. Invoices and worries, dreams that kept you awake, silent prayers whispered into the glow of a phone screen. You are not greedy, you are responsible. And sometimes responsibility feels like a storm that never fully passes. You want enough to breathe, enough to bless, enough to stop bargaining with anxiety at midnight. I see that ache. I respect it, and I honor the part of you that refuses to settle for a life where your soul and your schedule are always at war. There is an older wisdom that speaks into this very tension, and it does not shout, it invites. It does not accuse. It returns us to a center we were never meant to leave. In the stillness, it asks a simple, piercing question. Are you chasing wealth or receiving the power that creates it? That question is not a riddle. It is a key. When you hold the key, doors that look like stone begin to move. Pressure loosens its grip. Your nervous system, taught for years to brace for lack, begins to relax into trust. And in that calmer state, your mind thinks more clearly, sees patterns faster, and hears guidance you've been missing in all the noise. Remember the Lord your God, the ancient line reads, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant. This is not a spell or a slogan. It is a way of seeing. To remember is more than recalling words. It is to return the members of your life to their rightful order. When memory is anchored in source, attention recalibrates, and the very machinery of your brain begins to look for what aligns with purpose rather than what merely stimulates fear. Gratitude sharpens perception. Humility widens the field of view. You notice opportunities that were always near, but invisible while you were busy negotiating with panic. This verse speaks of power, not possessions, capacity, not mere coins. Power looks like skill maturing through practice, wisdom tested in quiet rooms, favor that opens a door you could not pry. Power is the steady hand that builds value, the honest scale that refuses the quick, crooked gain, the resilient heart that can withstand abundance without losing itself. Wealth, in this frame, is not the trophy. It is the tool that proves a deeper promise at work in you. That promise is not about ego. It is about establishment. Roots that outlast the season, structures that bless more than your reflection, a name that becomes shelter instead of advertisement. When we forget the giver, the mind contracts, the breath shallows, and even large numbers cannot quiet a loud fear. But when we remember, the body settles, the conscience clears, and decision-making rises above the storm. So let your breathing lengthen. Let the shoulders lower. Let the heart steady in the knowledge that you were never asked to manufacture meaning out of thin air. You were entrusted with power, and power grows when it is remembered, stewarded, and aimed at covenant rather than applause. You do not need to perform for providence. You need to align with it. Remember who gave you the mind you carry, the hands you use, the favor that has met you in unexpected places. Remember, and let that remembrance become the quiet engine of your prosperity. From this center, the path ahead will not only make sense, it will make you whole as it makes you fruitful. There is a quiet mechanism beneath every visible gain, a covenant engine that begins turning long before numbers rise. It hums inside memory, motive, and the way a life holds its center under pressure. Many stories about money begin with strategies and end with fatigue. This one begins with remembrance and ends with steadiness. In that steadiness, desire becomes clean, choices become patient, and opportunities stop feeling like mirages that vanish when pursued. The heart recognizes its source, and from that recognition, power, not mere possession, starts to flow in a way that does not fracture the soul. The forgetfulness tax. How success makes us blind to source, pain. The phrase names a cost many lives quietly pay. When a season finally yields fruit, attention narrows around the fruit itself, and the roots go unnoticed. The nervous system, trained by scarcity to scan for threats, begins scanning for status instead, and the shift feels subtle, almost harmless. Yet, forgetfulness carries interest. Anxiety returns wearing a better outfit, and the mind that once prayed for doors now fears losing hallways. In the brain, stress reclaims territory. The amygdala grows louder, the prefrontal cortex loses clarity, and decisions slip from principled to reactive. Remembering interrupts this drift. Not an abstract memory, but a felt recollection. Breath slowing, gratitude warming the chest, the story of provision replayed until the body believes it again. In that physiological return, costs stop compounding. Power versus possession. God gives capacity, not cash. Expectation breaker. Possession can be counted. Power is measured by what it can create, sustain, and repair. Possession sits, power builds. Possession calms today, power secures tomorrow. Capacity looks like sharpened skill, trustworthy judgment, favor that opens the right room at the right time. It feels like the inner elasticity that absorbs surprises without snapping. It sounds like wisdom that says no when applause says yes. When the verse speaks of power to get wealth, it speaks of this interior architecture. The gift arrives as potential, as ability, as relational credibility, as a mind increasingly organized around value creation rather than value extraction. Wealth then becomes a byproduct of cultivated capacity, not an idol to be chased across deserts of exhaustion. Purpose of prosperity. Wealth as proof of covenant, not ego, distortion, truth. Ego pursues wealth as a mirror. Covenant regards wealth as a message. A mirror turns everything inward. A message travels outward. When increase validates promise rather than personality, the soul stops performing and starts stewarding. In the body, this shift feels like exhale. The shoulders lower, the jaw releases, vigilance softens. The mind sees people rather than props. Business models begin to carry mercy inside their math. Goals remain ambitious, yet the ache to be impressive dissolves. And in that dissolution, creativity rises. Numbers, like servants rather than masters, align themselves around long horizons. Humility as risk management, the posture that keeps doors open, practical shift. Humility is often mistaken for timidity. In practice, it functions like an elite risk system. It increases learning speed because feedback is not a threat. It multiplies counsel because wisdom is welcome from beyond one's reflection. It reduces unforced errors because the hands that know they did not build the ocean hold the boat with reverence. Humility lowers volatility in relationships, the true infrastructure of any venture, and volatility is where fortunes often leak. In the brain, humility loosens the grip of defensiveness, restoring blood flow to regions that weigh probabilities and imagine consequence. With that flow restored, discernment returns, and doors notice the posture that will not kick them down or brag once inside. No sorrow. Principle, building riches that don't break your soul. Metaphor, anchor. The image of an anchor belongs here, not the kind that sinks courage, but the kind that steadies it. Gain without inner anchoring drifts toward frantic maintenance. Every new level introduces a new panic, and the calendar fills with tasks that feel like lifeguards watching a pool no one enjoys. Anchored gain moves differently. It resists the trade where integrity is exchanged for acceleration. It prefers clean margins to loud milestones. It welcomes Sabbath as strategy, review as renewal, and celebration as witness rather than spectacle. Neuroscience would call this an integrated state. Sympathetic energy available for action, parasympathetic calm available for rest, so that prosperity does not require a body stuck in fight or flight. Across these lines runs a single thread: memory shaping motive, motive shaping method, method shaping outcomes. The covenant engine begins in remembrance and turns with humility, alignment, and anchored desire. In practice, it sounds like conversations that protect fairness when no one is watching. It looks like contracts designed to keep promises, not only profits. It feels like a pace that proves you are possessed by purpose, not by hurry. And it leaves behind a residue, peace that lingers after the meeting, clarity that returns in the morning, relationships that grow stronger as projects grow larger. The world will continue to confuse possession for power, and now and then the heart may feel the pull of that confusion. The forgetfulness tax, will present its invoice again. The mirror of ego will catch the light. Doors will test posture. The anchor will be tempted to lift. In those moments, the covenant engine does what engines do. It turns persistent and quiet, fueled by remembrance. Power rises where possession once boasted. Purpose corrects the compass. Humility lowers the risk that pride inflates. Peace saturates the gain it guards. This is where wealth begins, long before money moves, and this is where it continues, long after applause fades. There is a kind of remembering that is not mental, but muscular, not a list of facts, but a posture the whole being adopts. It feels like coming home to a room you had locked for safekeeping and forgotten, the air cooler, the light softer, a stillness that begins to order the noise. In this room, the body stops bracing for loss and starts recognizing patterns of care that have threaded through the years. The mind, relieved of constant defense, can finally observe. And when observation returns, so does discernment. Connections appear between people and possibilities. Timing reveals itself, and what looked like randomness shows a hidden rhythm. Memory, in this sense, turns into a money skill because it restores clarity at the very point where fear would have chosen speed. Daily remembrance ritual, 3-minute practice that recenters motive practice. The words name something small yet profound, like striking a tuning fork before music begins. 3 minutes is not a commandment. It is a doorway, a breath that lengthens, a phrase that steadies. A moment of honest motive check where the heart asks, quietly, why pursue this, and at what cost to my peace? Neuroscience would call this a shift from reactivity to regulation, the nervous system moving from hypervigilance toward balance. In that balance, the prefrontal cortex, the part that plans, weighs, chooses, reclaims leadership. Choices made from that state tend to honor both purpose and people, and money follows choices that create trust. Gratitude, opportunity detection, why thankful minds spot deals faster. Expectation breaker. Gratitude is not decoration. It is perception training. A thankful mind widens the field of view. The eyes stop searching for what might go wrong long enough to notice what is already aligned. In the brain, gratitude increases activity in regions associated with learning and valuation, which means it quietly upgrades the internal radar for value. Suddenly, a conversation that once felt ordinary reveals a doorframe. A problem that sounded tiresome becomes a map to service. Gratitude does not invent opportunity. It uncovers it by loosening the grip of fear so curiosity can breathe. Story strategy. Rewrite your money narrative to align with calling. Perception shift. Strategy without a healed story becomes a treadmill. The body moves, the scenery repeats. When the inner narrative says, I am always behind, spreadsheets become survival tools, and generosity feels dangerous. But when the story shifts toward calling, toward the conviction that life is meant to build, bless, and establish, strategy gains oxygen. Plans become vehicles for meaning, not shields against shame. Memory participates here too, recalling how provision arrived in unlikely seasons, how guidance emerged at the last possible hour, how closed doors rerouted toward wiser paths. Each recollection edits the script the amygdala tries to direct, and your decisions begin to flow from coherence rather than fear of exposure. Rhythms of rest, strategic pauses that sharpen performance. Metaphor, bowstring. The bowstring does not lose power by resting. It stores it. In the same way, rest is not retreat from results. It is the condition that makes clean results possible. In rest, cortisol resets, inflammation reduces, clutter clears. Ideas return with edges smooth enough to touch and strong enough to carry weight. The calendar learns to hold space the way lungs hold air between words, and when effort resumes, it carries precision, fewer strokes, deeper impact, less noise. The rhythm, tension, release, aim, protects both ambition and well-being, so that growth does not come at the expense of the person doing the growing. Celebrate the giver, steward the gift, guard against subtle idolatry, distortion, truth. Celebration reorders allegiance. The heart does not bow to outcomes when it bows in gratitude first. Subtle idolatry often arrives wearing the clothes of diligence, asking the soul to over-identify with output, to treat numbers like oxygen. Celebration reminds the inner world that oxygen has another source. It honors the fact that gifts were given, not self-manufactured, and that stewardship, not obsession, is the fitting response. This remembrance does not dilute excellence. It purifies it. Work becomes worship without becoming performance. Prosperity becomes witness without becoming spectacle. And relationships, the true conduits of sustained wealth, are protected from the corrosion of being treated like ladders. Memory, then, is not nostalgia. It is alignment. It is the daily embodied return to source that recalibrates motive, refines perception, and quiets the kind of fear that makes expensive choices. Remember to rise, and rising will look like clarity settling over confusion, like breathing room entering crowded schedules, like a gentle courage that keeps pace with wisdom. In that atmosphere, opportunities stop hiding. Strategies stop fighting your nervous system, and wealth begins to gather around what is whole, not what is frantic. Every enduring structure rests on a handful of quiet forces, and this verse gathers them like a builder's tools placed in a careful row. The mind often searches for one decisive move, one brilliant tactic, yet the deepest transformation emerges when several levers move together, each small on its own, powerful in sequence. When these levers align, the inner world steadies, the outer world responds, and the path through uncertainty stops feeling like a wilderness and begins to resemble a road. Source, recognizing the giver, clarifies identity and limits. Foundation. Everything changes when the origin is clear. The heart softens because it is no longer performing for approval. It is partnering with a generosity already in motion. In the body, that recognition calms threat signals. The chest loosens, the breath lengthens, executive functions reclaim the wheel. Identity resolves into something both humble and secure, not the author of every outcome, yet chosen to carry meaning into them. Limits become honorable rather than humiliating. They outline a calling instead of announcing a deficiency. With source established, choices grow cleaner because they flow from belonging rather than from bargaining. Power, skills, wisdom, and favor as the true economic engine, expectation breaker. Power in this frame behaves like a living system. It grows through practice, feedback, and time. Skills refine into signature strengths. Wisdom emerges from pattern recognition across seasons. Favor opens doors that skill alone could not unlock. The nervous system reads this as safety earned through coherence, not through control. Pressure still arrives, but it lands on structure rather than on panic. Decisions gain a measured cadence. Partnerships deepen because credibility has weight. Opportunities begin to echo past faithfulness, and that echo becomes momentum. Getting, ethical action, diligence, and value creation, not windfalls. Practice. The verse does not romanticize outcomes, it dignifies process. Getting here is not grasping, it is the steady conversion of capacity into service, the honest exchange where solutions meet needs and both sides leave strengthened. Diligence turns into rhythm rather than grind, a sustainable pace with room for thinking, testing, revising. The body senses the difference. Grind tightens. Rhythm regulates. Windfalls may still appear, but they are no longer the plan, only a surprise that honors the plan. Value creation secures the future because it grows an orchard rather than chasing one meal. Wealth, provision plus purpose. More than cash flow. Perception shift. Wealth becomes wider than numbers without becoming vague. Provision keeps the lights on. Purpose decides why the lights matter. Together they produce a texture to life that spreadsheets cannot measure. The peace of clean margins, the warmth of right relationships, the relief of a calendar that does not punish the people it claims to serve. In the brain, this integration lessens the tug-of-war between reward pathways and moral conviction. Choices stop splitting the self. Ethics and excellence share the same room, and the atmosphere of that room invites creativity that lasts. Establish prosperity that builds promises across generations. Metaphor, pillar. Establishment feels different from expansion. Expansion stretches, establishment anchors. The image of a pillar belongs here, weight-bearing and quiet, shaped to hold more than its own beauty. When prosperity establishes, it sets patterns that remain when the spotlight moves on. Fair scales, transparent agreements, generosity that refuses to humiliate, craftsmanship that outlives trends. Nervous systems flourish in such spaces because predictability and fairness reduce chronic stress. Children breathe easier, teams think longer, communities begin to trust the ground beneath them. This is how a covenant becomes visible, not as a slogan, but as a structure people can lean on. Seen together, these levers form a choreography. Source settles identity, power matures capacity, getting converts capacity into service. Wealth integrates provision with purpose. Established secures the witness of it all. When the choreography holds, life stops chasing outcomes that cannot love it back and begins to build outcomes that carry love forward. The heart knows the difference. It sounds like relief, it looks like patience. It feels like strength that does not need to shout. A builder once purchased a plot where the wind spoke in long sentences and the soil kept the secrets of old rivers. He dreamed of roofs that caught morning light, halls where laughter gathered, rooms that remembered names. He carried instruments of precision and a heart that burned to begin. Yet the first thing he did was kneel to the ground and listen. Days passed with nothing visible to boast about. He studied the layers beneath the surface, the quiet grammar of the land, the currents no eye could catch. Neighbors shook their heads. The builder smiled, not with pride, but with the peace of someone who understands that speed without depth is a debt with sharp interest. When the time finally came to raise the frame, he set pillars first. They descended like prayers, not as decoration, but as confession. Weight is holy. He drove them through soft stories into bedrock, and the sound was music, low, honest, steady. The village watched him measure, pause, measure again, as if he were listening for a note the earth alone could sing. Only then did beams appear, and only then did shadows begin to fall in the shape of shelter. A traveler asked why the pillars mattered so much. The builder ran a hand across the grain and said a simple line that lived longer than he did. Beauty can crown a house, but only truth can carry it. Years later, the river rose without warning, swollen by rains that arrived like rumors and turned certain streets into memory. Houses tried to float on hope. Some did for a breath, most did not. The builder's home did not argue with the storm. It spoke to it through the pillars, and the pillars answered with the calm strength of things established. Water licked the stones and receded. Inside, a child slept through thunder. A table kept its promise to hold bread. The air smelled like cedar and safety. No one praised the paint that week. Everyone blessed the work. No one had cheered when it was done. The builder grew old, and as his steps shortened, his reach widened. He taught his sons and daughters the craft of weight-bearing choices, the love that chooses integrity over applause, the patience that refuses to mortgage tomorrow for noise tonight. In his workshop, there hung 3 tools he used as stories. A pillar, to remember that foundations are invisible and indispensable. A millstone, to honor steady effort that grinds grain into bread instead of grinding the soul into powder. A compass, to keep direction when weather tries to confuse destination with distraction. He would place a hand on each and repeat himself with that soft stubbornness the wise are known for. Roots before branches, bread before banners, true north before any journey. When he died, the village said they had lost a builder and found a legacy. Children who had once splashed barefoot in puddles now brought their children to touch the quiet wood of those old tools. Families gathered in rooms that refused to creak under the weight of joy. Agreements held when tempers tried to unmake them. The market trusted its scales. The river still rose some springs because rivers do what rivers do, yet fear no longer set the price of peace. In the nervous systems of those homes, something had settled, breath that did not race at every cloud, minds that could plan without bracing for betrayal, hearts that recognized the feeling of being carried rather than constantly performing. This is how establishment sounds when it enters a life. Not a trumpet at noon, but a hymn at dawn that keeps playing while the day makes its demands. Beneath the craft you can see the covenant, and beneath the covenant you can feel the steadying of a presence that does not confuse possession with power. The story remembers us to ourselves. It reminds the body that safety can be honest, that growth can be quiet, that wealth can be weight-bearing and kind. And in the hush after the telling, the pillars stand the way hope stands when it has learned to love the ground it rests on. There are fractures that don't announce themselves with noise, slow leaks that don't stain the floor, small shadows that bend the light just enough to change the room without anyone naming why. These are the saboteurs, and they work not by shouting down vision but by loosening its anchors, not by stealing resources but by thinning the soul that stewards them. The body senses their presence before the mind finds the words, a tightness at the base of the neck, a vigilance that refuses to turn off, a sleep that looks like rest but never restores. What follows is not accusation. It is the gentle uncovering that allows strength to return to its rightful place. Pride amnesia. My hand did this, and the collapse that follows, pain. Pride in this form does not look like fireworks. It looks like forgetting the wind while praising the sail. It is subtle, almost reasonable, a quiet migration from gratitude to self-congratulation that the nervous system registers as pressure to maintain a performance it never created alone. The voice inside begins to say, without malice, yet with certainty, "This depends on me entirely," and the body obeys with clenched muscles and hurried breath. Decisions grow brittle because they must protect an image. Counsel sounds like interference. Margins shrink not only on spreadsheets, but in the soul's capacity to absorb surprise. Collapse arrives in pieces, a misjudged risk, a relationship fatigued by defensiveness, a pace that extracts more than it yields. Memory heals this amnesia, memory that replays unlikely doors opening, unexpected favor-meeting preparation, rescue arriving at the hour when spreadsheets had no more lines to offer, until the heart can say again with relief, "I was carried, and I am still being carried." Entitlement illusion, confusing access with ownership, distortion truth. Entitlement speaks calmly, almost kindly, and confuses proximity with possession. It treats opportunities like inheritance without responsibilities and relationships like supply lines rather than trusts. The distortion creates a chemical cocktail of urgency and disdain. Urgency because something feels owed and might be delayed. Disdain because people begin to look like obstacles when they do not comply. In the brain, this cocktail narrows empathy and overactivates reward pathways, so choices tilt toward short-term gain and long-term erosion. Truth, when it returns, restores proportion. Access is a door, not the deed. Ownership is stewardship signed by integrity. The illusion dissolves when the inner world remembers that gifts are given to be tended, not exploited, and that the hand holding the key is at its best when it honors the house it enters. With that truth, appetite becomes appetite again rather than identity, and relationships regain the dignity of being ends in themselves, not means to an impatient end. Tool worship, when money becomes master. Expectation breaker. Tools are noble when they stay in their lane. They betray us when they become altars. Money, in this misalignment, stops serving wisdom and starts substituting for it, asking the heart to trust numbers for what only meaning can offer. The expectation breaker is simple and disruptive. More zeros do not equal more safety if the soul must fracture to keep them. Neuroscience observes that chronic fixation on gain activates stress loops similar to those produced by loss, because the fear of losing what defines identity mimics the fear of not having it in the first place. The result is a life that never exhales, hyperproductive, undernourished, surrounded by abundance, yet starved for enoughness. When tool worship breaks, silence returns first, a quieter room inside where value is measured by alignment, not applause. Money steps back onto the workbench, useful again, accurate again, ready to measure, ready to fund, never again allowed to tell you who you are. Lone wolf leadership, rejecting counsel kills good plans. Practical warning. Isolation often disguises itself as focus, but its fruit tells the truth. Ideas cannot breathe, risks cannot be triangulated, and blind spots become steering wheels. The lone mind grows echo chambers, and echo chambers grow certainty that has never been tested by love. The physiology is revealing. Without trusted others, stress remains unprocessed. The body bears a full load of decision weight, and the prefrontal cortex tires under constant vigilance. Tired planning looks brave while quietly misreading weather. Counsel is not a crowd. It is calibrated companionship, the presence of eyes that want your good more than your approval and will name the rock beneath the surface before the hull pretends it is sky. Where counsel is welcomed, humility saves time, and plans live longer than the adrenaline that launched them. Crooked scales. Why injustice corrodes long-term gain. Metaphor. Rust. Rust rarely shouts. It appears as a color first, then a texture, then a hole where structure used to be. Injustice corrodes in the same slow way. Small compromises in measurement, small edits to truth in the contract, small nudges of price that humiliate the vulnerable. Each seems survivable, even smart, but the metal remembers. Trust thins in places the eye cannot see. Teams sense it and withhold their best. Partners mirror what they endure. Markets learn, slowly but surely, whose word requires a microscope. The cost compounds in silence. Legal hedges, brand fatigue, customer churn, the sleeplessness that arrives when the conscience measures more accurately than the ledger. Clean scales, like clean air, lengthen life expectancy. The soul breathes easier when it does not have to rehearse excuses. The mind thinks further when it is not preoccupied with covering tracks. The future stays intact because today did not salt the ground it hopes to harvest tomorrow. Together, these saboteurs do not simply interfere with outcomes. They interrupt becoming. They thin the patience that wisdom requires. They amplify the noise that fear prefers. And they train the body to live in a narrow corridor where survival masquerades as success. Naming them is not an act of shame. It is an act of repair. Where pride forgot, remembrance can return. Where entitlement confused, gratitude can clarify. Where tools were worshipped, meaning can reclaim the altar. Where isolation hardened, counsel can soften. Where scales tipped, justice can level. The heart recognizes the feel of these repairs. Shoulders lowering, breath lengthening, decisions recovering their dignity. And in that recovered dignity, the power to create wealth stops leaking through hairline cracks and begins to consolidate, steady and quiet, able to carry weight without breaking what carries it. There is a certain quiet confidence that rises when tools are laid out on a bench and each has a task it loves. No scrambling, no posturing, only the satisfaction of fit, the right edge meeting the right grain, the right pressure producing the right shape. Prosperity that lasts carries the same feel. It does not depend on dazzling moments. It rests on instruments of character and craft arranged with intention. The soul recognizes this atmosphere. The breath slows. The hands steady. The mind stops hunting for shortcuts and begins listening for excellence. Skill stacking, becoming excellent at your work to stand before kings. Practice. Excellence here is not perfection, it is coherence. Discrete abilities arranged so they help one another sing. A voice for detail finds rhythm with a vision for the whole. Technical strength learns the language of empathy, so solutions are not only correct but kind. Over time, these layers become a signature, an integrity of style that clients and communities can recognize in a crowded room. Neuroscience has a way of describing this maturity. Networks wire together through repeated, meaningful practice until effort feels like flow. The body knows the sensation. The shoulders loosen even while focus deepens. Time expands just enough to place a thought exactly where it belongs, and the work begins to draw invitations that feel like alignment rather than accident. Standing before kings reads less like spectacle and more like suitability. Doors open because the work deserves the room. Diligence as a flywheel. Small, steady inputs that compound. Metaphor. Millstone. The millstone turns with an unglamorous grace. Grain becomes flour not through frenzy but through rhythm. Diligence functions the same way in a life. It is the pattern that keeps promises with the calendar, the quiet repetition that builds strength, the way muscle fibers thicken under measured load. The nervous system trusts this pace. Cortisol does not spike when consistency is honored, and creativity visits more often when it knows it will be welcomed rather than squeezed. Over seasons, the compounding appears. A reputation that needs fewer introductions, a library of solved problems that speeds future decisions, a body that can deliver quality without borrowing tomorrow's strength. The flywheel gathers its own momentum. The effort of beginning diminishes because the structure remembers how to move. Integrity moat, trust as your non-copyable advantage. Expectation breaker. Many advantages can be purchased, imitated, or outbid. Trust resists all three. A moat is not merely water. It is distance between a precious center and the erosion that would cheapen it. Integrity creates that distance. It refuses the unsaid clause that would quietly exploit, the flattering math that would dress harm as cleverness, the secrecy that would confuse privacy with deceit. Over time, this refusal does something rare. It simplifies the inner world. The conscience stops carrying double books. The body stops anticipating exposure, and attention, now freed, pours into craft and care. Markets eventually notice what the nervous system noticed first: calm competence that keeps its word. And this noticing matures into loyalty. In a world fascinated by speed, the expectation breaker is simple. Nothing compounds like trust, and nothing rots an orchard like shortcuts. Wise alliances, counsel, partnerships, and timing. Practical shift. A single instrument can play a melody. A symphony requires others. Alliances in this frame are not crowded rooms. They are calibrated agreements where strengths interlock and blind spots lose leverage. Counsel contributes the aerial view when the road ahead looks convincing but crooked. Partnership supplies stamina when one set of hands would otherwise tremble under weight. Timing brings the grace of seasons, knowing when the soil is resting and when it is ready, when patience protects value and when delay dissolves it. The body relaxes in such company because vigilance is shared. The prefrontal cortex no longer bears every contingency alone. Plans breathe, decisions unspool with more light and less heat, and when change arrives, the circle absorbs the shock in ways a single spine was never designed to endure. Generosity loop, how open hands attract opportunity. Perception shift. Open hands do not signal naivete, they signal an economy larger than fear. Generosity in this loop is not only about money, it also includes attention that truly listens. Introductions offered without keeping score, knowledge shared to raise the waterline. The loop forms because generosity clarifies identity. One is a steward, not a hoarder, a conduit, not a cul-de-sac. From a neurological angle, generosity reduces hyperfocus on scarcity and widens perception. The mind begins to notice intersections where mutual benefit lives. People move toward that signal, rooms open to that posture, and opportunities, those delicate birds that avoid cages, choose shoulders that feel like habitat, not hunt. Together, these tools produce a music that grows steadier the longer it plays. Skill stacking shapes a voice worth hearing. Diligence keeps the tempo when applause fades. Integrity surrounds the song with walls that keep it true. Alliances add texture and volume without drowning the theme. Generosity turns performance into communion. In that arrangement, the person and the work stop competing. They cooperate. The calendar stops acting like an adversary and starts behaving like soil. And wealth, no longer an audition for belonging, becomes the witness of a life arranged around value that blesses more than one set of hands. There is a way of building that does not leave the heart limping behind the balance sheet, a way that gathers increase without scattering peace. It begins with a quieter math, the kind that counts the cost to the nervous system as carefully as it counts the revenue column, that listens to conscience as closely as it listens to forecasts. This blueprint does not rush. It remembers. It does not grasp. It aligns. And alignment has a feeling in the body. Breath that does not hurry. Shoulders that don't wear armor to meetings. Decisions that hold their shape after midnight. Here, prosperity grows roots deep enough to hold when weather changes its mind. Define enough, setting ceilings and floors to tame greed. Practice. Enough is not a fence around joy. It is a frame that protects it. When a life names its flaw, anxiety loses the megaphone that screams scarcity at every turn. When a life names its ceiling, appetite remembers it is a guest, not a king. The brain benefits from these boundaries. Reward circuits no longer chase novelty to soothe nameless dread, and planning regions regain authority. In that clarity, purchases stop pretending to be cures, growth stops disguising exhaustion as ambition, and the calendar stops punishing the body for wanting rest. Enough is not smallness. It is proportion. It is the room where desire can breathe without devouring the house that holds it. Profit with purpose, aligning margins to mission. Expectation breaker. Profit, divorced from purpose, behaves like a runaway river, loud, impressive, and able to ruin a valley by morning. Linked to mission, it becomes irrigation, steady and life-giving. The expectation breaker lives here. Margins can be generous and gentle at the same time, because meaning disciplines money without diminishing it. In the nervous system, coherence appears. Values and strategies stop arguing. Cortisol calms, and creativity returns with ideas that can be told to children without changing the details. Mission clarifies what belongs and what merely flatters. As purpose pulls profit into its orbit, the numbers learn what they are for, and that knowledge steadies them. Guardrails for gain, rules for deals you won't touch. Practical shift. Every road that respects human life has edges that say, not here. Gain needs the same mercy. Naming the lines that cannot be crossed simplifies the future. The soul will not need to negotiate under pressure what it already chose in the light. Physiologically, guardrails reduce decision fatigue, because options that harm integrity never make the shortlist, and the body reads that safety as relief. Trust grows in the spaces shaped by such refusals. Partners relax. Teams think longer. Clients sense the quiet weight of promises that will not be bent by weather. Guardrails do not make the path narrow. They make it navigable. Rhythms of renewal, Sabbath, celebration, and review cycles. Metaphor, brake, throttle. Engines are built with both forces in mind, the capacity to move and the capacity to stop. Brake and throttle together create control. Renewal works the same way. Pauses, when honored, turn depletion into preparation. Celebration, when honest, turns achievement into remembrance instead of addiction. Review, when gentle and rigorous, turns mistakes into material rather than into shame. The body answers with gratitude. Sleep deepens, inflammation lowers, attention sharpens. Work begins to feel like a conversation rather than a chase. The rhythm protects what hustle cannot, the person doing the building. Legacy architecture, inheritance, impact, and name building, perception shift. Legacy is not a statue with a plaque. It is a structure people live inside without realizing who first drew the lines. It includes inheritance that equips rather than entitles, impact that continues when the spotlight moves, and a name that functions like shelter rather than advertisement. This perception shift widens time. Decisions slow down to match their future weight. The mind considers children not yet born and strangers not yet met. And strangely, this longer view does not dilute urgency, it purifies it. The nervous system recognizes the relief of playing a longer game, less panic, more patience, fewer detours that flatter the moment while robbing tomorrow. Put together, these elements create a climate where wealth can breathe without breeding sorrow. Enough defines the room. Purpose furnishes it. Guardrails keep the windows clear. Renewal opens and closes them with wisdom. Legacy decides who else gets a key. And when storms arrive, as they do in every story, this house does not require denial to stand. It requires only what it already carries. proportion, meaning, boundaries, rest, and a future large enough to welcome the lives that will lean on the strength built here. 30 days can feel like a small room or like a garden, depending on what enters through the door. When wilderness seasons drag the feet and cloud the mind, time often turns into a corridor of worry, yet the same span, held with remembrance, becomes a slow turning of the soil. Capacity grows in quiet ways. Attention returns from its scattering. The body finds a pace that does not bruise the spirit. In that gentler climate, the verse stops sounding like an idea and begins behaving like an experience. Power taking form, not as noise, but as steady orientation. A remembrance routine, scripture, gratitude, and motive check practice. The day greets those who greet it, and remembrance becomes the greeting. A line of scripture rises like light under a door. Gratitude loosens the clenched places behind the ribs. Motive steps into view without costume, asking for honesty rather than performance. Physiology follows this order. The nervous system shifts from bracing to balance. The prefrontal cortex gains room, and choices prepare to move from coherence instead of compulsion. 3 minutes can hold more than they appear to hold when they are filled with attention, when the heart returns to source before approaching tasks. Value inventory, mapping skills to market needs. Practical shift. Inventory, in this sense, reads like a conversation between identity and usefulness. Skills, both named and forgotten, line up along the table. Patterns of competence reveal themselves. The signature strengths that once felt ordinary step into color. Across the room, needs take shape. Real problems with faces, not abstractions with slogans. Mapping one to the other quiets the old drama of chasing opportunity and replaces it with suitability. The brain, seeing fit rather than force, reduces threat responses and increases curiosity. Work begins to resemble service that pays rather than survival that drains. Opportunity map, relationships, problems, and timing windows. Expectation breaker. Opportunity rarely arrives as a drum roll. More often it hides inside relationships, within persistent problems, and beneath the timing that now makes sense in hindsight. The expectation breaker here is gentle. The extraordinary wears the clothing of the familiar. A conversation repeated over months contains a hinge. A problem others tolerate because it is tiresome contains a door. A timing window, once misread as delay, reveals itself as protection. When the mind is not handcuffed to urgency, it can observe these intersections. Cortisol lowers, pattern recognition improves, and what once felt random discloses its rhythm. Integrity audit, pricing, promises, and fairness tests, distortion, truth. Audits are not accusations, they are mirrors designed for repair. Pricing tells the truth about value and about conscience, both. Promises reveal their weight when no one is watching. Fairness stands in the corner, quiet and resolute, asking whether gain remains clean when magnified. Where distortion once called exploitation savvy, truth restores language, work honored, people dignified, numbers consistent with the story being told. Bodies relax in rooms where fairness is not a performance. Teams think longer, partners lean in without flinching. Long-term wealth prefers these atmospheres because they do not corrode the hands that hold it. Generosity plan, pre-deciding giving to anchor the heart. Metaphor, compass. The compass does not eliminate weather. It preserves direction. Pre-deciding generosity functions the same way. When the heart chooses its north before storms argue, gain no longer negotiates with fear each time it visits. From a neurological view, such pre-commitment reduces decision fatigue and prevents scarcity narratives from hijacking the moment. The inner world learns that increase flows through, not merely to. Open hands keep circulation healthy. Identity stays rooted in stewardship rather than accumulation. The result is not loss. It is lightness, the sense that prosperity belongs to a story larger than applause. 30 days held in this pattern do not promise spectacle. They promise orientation. Remembrance steadies motive. Inventory reveals fit. Opportunity comes into focus without shouting. Integrity keeps the frame from warping under weight. Generosity assigns direction when clouds gather. In that order, the wilderness thins. Wisdom takes its place. The body feels the change first, breath that does not argue with time, shoulders that stop translating every task into threat, attention that lands where it can build. And wealth, faithful to its origin in power rather than mere possession, begins to collect around what is whole, leaving behind a trail of peace that does not need to be explained. Across these minutes, a pattern has been forming like a constellation, points that mattered on their own, now drawing lines between them until a figure emerges you can recognize in the dark. The figure is simple and strong. Remember the source. Receive the power, practice with integrity, establish what endures. Each chapter has been a limb of that body, and now the body stands. The nervous system recognizes its shape before the mind gives it names, breath that no longer argues, shoulders that no longer lift like shields, a steadier pulse as choices stop pretending to be emergencies. What felt scattered begins to settle. What felt complicated begins to cohere. Memory brought you home to the room beneath striving, where motive unclenches and gratitude trains the eyes to notice what fear hides. Power shifted from a fantasy of possession to the architecture of capacity. Skills maturing, wisdom widening, favor meeting preparation in rooms where character fits the chair. Practice taught the dignity of getting, the way steady work converts ability into service without grinding the soul into dust. Wealth took on a wider horizon, provision married to purpose until numbers learned what they are for and stopped demanding to be worshipped. Establishment anchored the whole story, pillars before paint, truth before display, a name that functions like shelter rather than advertisement. The saboteurs came into the light without shame, pride that forgets, entitlement that confuses, tool worship that tries to replace meaning with math, isolation that mistakes silence for clarity, injustice that corrodes like rust in the seams. Seeing them was not an indictment. It was the beginning of repair. Tools returned to their places, skill stacked until it sang, diligence turned like a millstone with quiet strength, integrity deepened its moat around the heart of the work, alliances added breadth and stamina, generosity kept circulation healthy so increase would not stagnate. Guardrails framed the road, renewal taught brake and throttle, legacy stretched time until urgency became clean again. Notice the body's agreement with this order. When values and methods align, cortisol lowers, attention steadies, and the prefrontal cortex takes its rightful seat. Decision-making lengthens its view and shrinks its noise. The amygdala still speaks, as it should, but it no longer conducts the orchestra. In that calmer chemistry, your perception sharpens, patterns appear. The right doors feel less like accidents and more like recognition. What begins as spiritual remembrance becomes a neurological reality. Coherence you can feel, clarity you can trust, strength that does not need to shout to be heard. There is a question that waits at the edge of such clarity, and it is not a question of fear. If the giver has already entrusted you with power to create wealth, what will be established through your hands that outlives your calendar and blesses faces you may never meet? The heart knows this question by the way. It softens the jaw and steadies the gaze. It does not demand spectacle. It asks for truth. It asks for rooms where fairness is routine, where excellence is kind, where promises keep their shape even when weather forgets its manners. Let this be the quiet benediction written over the days ahead. Not a drum roll, but a steadying. Not a performance, but a posture. Remember the source. Honor the power. Keep the practices clean. Build what can carry weight. And when prosperity arrives, as it often does where peace has prepared a place for it, may it find you already established, rooted enough to receive without grasping, clear enough to give without fear, and wise enough to turn gain into shelter that speaks long after the noise has moved on.